to the CSFL Kickoff Show podcast. You have, of course, today got myself, Coach Fury, on the channel to try and talk our way through some of the interesting off-season items that have been happening. We are going to be talking about blockbuster trades involving quarterbacks, defensive ends, all kinds of things that have happened since the off-season has begun. We're going to be breaking down free agency signings, looking at some of the good moves, some of the interesting moves, and what that could possibly do in terms of the league shake-up. And then finally, we're going to be talking a little bit about the draft that is coming up on this Friday, trying to give you guys a bit of a breakdown of what's happening there, interesting things, maybe some helpful hints and tips to help navigate through the draft in the CSFL, which I'm sure is going to be a really, really interesting one this season. So let's get ourselves started here and let's dive straight into the main item that I want to begin with on the show. And that is, of course, the big blockbuster trade that happened at the beginning of the off-season. The Aaron Rodgers move from the Tennessee Titans over to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in exchange for essentially Cam Johnson, Sean Weatherspoon, a couple of first-round picks, and Jameis Winston. Huge move by both teams. Let's try and break it down and work out positives and the negatives, maybe what each team might need to do to think about this offseason to try and round out that deal and make it a win for them. So if we begin, of course, on here with the Tennessee Titans, moving on from Rodgers is just huge. We all know the Titans had a fantastic regular season last year, going unbeaten. The third team only to have ever done that in the CSFL. So that is a huge achievement to Josh and his GM and coaching skills. So massive congratulations to that. But as we know, that was not enough for the Titans to bring back the Super Bowl over to the AFC. It headed, of course, over to the LA Rams this season. So what does that mean for any type of GM? It means probably a bit of a shake-up, but I'm sure nobody who is watching this now would have thought that Aaron Rodgers would have actually been dealt this offseason and so quickly. But they've decided to move on from Rodgers and have decided that Jameis Winston is going to be their man for the time being, and he's going to be leading the line for them as their quarterback. Obviously, this is a downgrade, in my opinion, from Aaron Rodgers. I don't think anyone will be questioning that, really. But it's going to bring some interesting challenges for the Titans to think about. Of course, the Rodgers deal was probably a little bit about moving on from a possible Pro Bowler, Hall of Fame type quarterback that we may see in the CSFL once he retires. But it was essentially to try and get those assets and values back for Rodgers now. So from the Titans' point of view, for longevity, I can certainly see the argument for making that move. But it does leave an interesting conundrum for them to try and navigate through if they do want to go back to the Super Bowl next year, in my opinion. So if we look at Jameis Winston here, we all know that the massive thing about Winston in the CSFL is that he has great accuracy, a great arm, he has movement, he can get out and about. So thinking of Josh and his Vince Young days, he could probably replicate some of those elements with Winston. But of course, we all know the intelligence for Winston is a little bit lower than we probably would want for an elite type of quarterback. And of course, being a rookie, his endurance is quite low as well. So Josh is going to certainly have to think about game planning with Winston. He can obviously hit any type of deep ball, but has he got the intelligence to maybe make the play, make the right selection all the time? There's probably going to be a bit more errors caused by the Titans this year if I'm looking at Winston. But another part of the package, which I think was really interesting, is Johnson. So let's get ourselves over to him. I think he's a really interesting prospect. He's 28 years old. Obviously, he's got a great deal. I think he could be interesting because he gives them that little bit of depth in the defensive end position. And on the face of it, when that deal was completed, I thought, okay, Cam Johnson, Jeremy Bill, that's an okay line in terms of your defensive line. But as we know, Josh didn't sit on his laurels. Certainly, he went and managed to acquire Von Miller, who is just completely dwarfed everything in respect to Cam Johnson arriving. So, from my view, the Titans, I can certainly understand why they made this move. Would I have made it? Probably not, because I would have carried on utilising Rodgers probably until he retired. I just felt that he's just simply so elite that he's a difficult person to replace, and they're probably never going to replace someone like that through a trade like that. You're always going to lose on the talent probably when you do trade someone like Rodgers. But I'm really, really interested to see what Josh does with Winston. He had an okay year in Tampa, but obviously there's room for growth and room for improvement. And if we look at his progression, it'll be interesting to see how that goes through the training camp scenario towards the end of the offseason. But as in any trade, there's always another side to it. So if we head over to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and let's talk about it from their perspective. Of course, they've managed to acquire Aaron Rodgers, who is arguably one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the league and will continue to be so probably until he retires. He has phenomenal arm, phenomenal intelligence, accuracy. He's actually not bad in the pocket. He's got some agility and some movement there, so he can scramble a little bit. He's obviously never going to really run with it, but he's a pure elite quarterback, pocket quarterback. And we've seen that during his short stay in Tennessee and his time with the Green Bay Packers in the early seasons. Really, the big thing that has really been hanging over Aaron Rodgers since he entered, since we started the league, actually, he has been fairly injury prone. So, in terms of the prospect for Tampa, huge upgrade at quarterback. There's no question about that. In terms of if you've made the move and you feel you can turn this team into a contender, which we certainly will talk about in a minute, fantastic option. The only thing is that we know Aaron Rodgers usually gets injured fairly regularly. So he's only actually managed to start all 16 games for his franchise twice, and that was in the first 2 seasons before he got a horrific injury, and also in 2015, I should say. But in recent years, he's obviously struggled in that respect. He hasn't played all his games. He's got a bit of an injury record. If we pull up his injuries, so obviously even last season, he had a couple of injuries there. Obviously, the meniscus was the Super Bowl. He had an injury. So the big thing that I think hanging over this Rodgers acquisition is going to be whether Rodgers can stay healthy. Rodgers can stay healthy. Fantastic transaction for Tampa Bay. But there is a question about whether Rodgers is enough to turn this Tampa Bay side from being a team that struggled through parts of last season to being a true contender in the NFC. And for me, they've obviously got to make a lot of other moves. If we scroll through, I mean, the offensive line is patchy in places. As you can see from just looking through, there's probably enough to put a line together there, but I worry if there's an injury there, the downgrade is going to be very significant for them. Then if we look over in terms of the options at tight end and the receiving options, I'm a little bit concerned with this. So Tampa Bay obviously have Hernandez and Hopkins, which is great. That's 2 options, but arguably to be a proper elite side on the offensive side, you do need probably more than those 2 options. If it was me, I would like to move Hernandez back to tight end and probably get another better wide receiver option. I personally don't see someone like Mike Evans standing up to that. And they have depth there, but probably not the right type of depth, I would say, to be a contending team. If we go through, I mean, I'm fairly comfortable with Tampa. Outside of that, on the offensive side, I think they just need to get those receiving options, tie up some of that offensive line, and that offense should start clicking. The question then becomes how the game planning works for Tampa, and I'm going to be very interested to see how they do that, because we know it's one thing to have the talent, but the other thing about this game, which we all find fascinating, is the game planning side, and I'm going to be really interested to see what Tampa does with that respect. So let's talk about some of the major transactions through the offseason so far. I'm sure as we get to the draft, we are going to see huge amounts of chaos, probably even more moves even more crazy deals, and I have no doubt about that. Mainly because Carolina have a silly amount of picks, and we all know that Kairos and Carolina, they don't tend to stay static. There will be trades, there will be chaos in the draft, and we will break down some of that towards the end of this show. But before we do that, I want to talk about a couple of interesting things in free agency, a couple of signings, and one team in particular that I'm really, really excited to see how the rest of their offseason goes, and how some of this molds probably into transitioning this team from being very competitive to maybe, I say very early in the offseason, a contender. So let's head over to the Miami Dolphins, who have had a really, really interesting offseason so far. I mean, we'll talk about some of their signings. So obviously the big one for Miami is bringing in Ben Roethlisberger. Still a very, very elite quarterback in this league. Has accuracy, arm intelligence, all the things you want, endurance. He's been one of these quarterbacks I think has been a bit unlucky. The teams he's been in, they've sort of been struggling at times and probably hasn't really shown the full capability of what he can bring to a team. So I'm really interested to see how Miami, in particular John, the GM knows, has got a grasp on the coaching now, how he uses Big Ben, because I think it could be a breakout year for him, if I'm being perfectly honest. I could see him going back to some of those early days in the 2010-2011 season with that rating and his accuracy, etc. So I'm really excited to see how that one plays out. But the Miami Dolphins didn't just stop there with some of their signings. I mean, they've also really cleaned up in some key positions I felt that they needed. Obviously bringing Brandon Merriweather in, good pickup, solid, strong safety still. He's perfectly good. Trufant, really, really good cornerback. He can tackle, he's got speed, he can basically cover anyone. I'm really excited to see how that plays out. And another one, obviously, Terrell Johnson. I thought he was also very, very solid pickup, and on that value type of deal is great. Bringing in guys like Trent Williams and McSurdy, fine, they're all good. But I'm really excited to see how this roster plays out now, because when you look at those signings and you look at this roster now, this is fascinating, because obviously bringing Big Ben in on a fantastic salary basically makes the likes of Lindley and McCoy expendable. And so if they can clear that and maybe get something there, that's going to give them some more assets to acquire some additional personnel that they might need. But I also really like the offensive line that they've got. I think there's enough talent there to really help Big Ben make the right play most of the time and not have too much pressure on him. They've also got Carl Rudolph, who's still here, fantastic option. The receiving core is pretty okay. We'll just dive to it here. I think this is going to be fine for them. I think Bez is fine. I think Durham's underrated and a really good pickup. So I think they're going to be in good shape. I mean, you could probably argue they might want to pick up another receiving option if they can, which is where I think the likes of the salaries of McCoy and Lindley come into play, because they're easy salaries that they can get rid of and maybe get that type of star receiving option that they might want. So I'm really, really excited to see how this Dolphins team does. I think, they've got cap room, they've got picks, they've got options available on both sides of the ball. They've got really good talent now, so it's just a case of bringing it all together for the Dolphins. But for me personally, I honestly thought whoever picked up Big Ben was going to have a bargain. But for a season, he's going to be just elite, and I'm really, really, really interested to see how Miami does with him, and whether he finally solves that quarterback crisis they've probably had over the past couple of years anyway. So that's a couple of free agency signings for the Dolphins. I mean, in terms of wider things, there's not a lot else I'd really sort of say stands out for me in terms of signings that sort of brings it together, maybe transitions the team as such. I thought the Oakland Raiders had a pretty good signing. If we just go to their dashboard now, I thought Garcon was a good pickup at $10 million. I'm not sure about the second year being a back heavy deal, but I think the Raiders were desperate for a receiving talent. I think acquiring him and Sean Spence are going to be interesting signings. High value signings, but probably needed signings for the Raiders. So we'll see what else happens in terms of the remaining parts of free agency. there's obviously not as much talent available through the next couple of rounds. But before we get to that stage and the remaining 5 rounds of the free agency period, we of course have to talk about the draft, because that is the next thing that is coming up this Friday. And let's try and take a little look and just see what some of the experts on the game are saying about the draft. Who do they think is going number 1? What do we think? How do we think about this draft? What things do we need to know going into it? And maybe a few little tips on the way. So it seems fairly consistent that either Nagaku or Jack are going to be going number 1. Vic Beasley is ranked very high, and Tyler Lockett. So we'll see how that plays out. I don't have a perspective on whether they're good or bad. I know that the top 10 has kind of shifted a lot as from what the GMs have sort of been saying on the Discord server, but we'll see. But what I'm really interested to talk about and just give a bit of a view on is generally how the scouting works and how the draft works in the CSFL. For those of you who are new, this might be interesting information. For those of you who have maybe been around a couple of seasons, it might be stuff you already know, but let's share some information. So in terms of how the CSFL draft works, obviously rounds 1 to 3 are done on the server. 4 to 7 are sort of individual sims per round that happen in a 24-hour period after each other. But obviously that will begin once round 3 has been concluded. It all kicks off on Friday. Obviously, anyone listening, go and do your scouting. It's probably the single most important thing you will need to do as a GM this offseason. If you don't do your scouting, you're going to find it very, very hard to find talent in the draft. But let's talk a little bit about some of the grades and how the system works, because I think there's some interesting things to just share here. So for those of you who don't know, there's obviously 2 types of sort of grade. There's obviously the attributes, and then there's the grades. The grades at the top and the attributes are all based on values against current active players. So it's really important to remember this, because anyone who's in free agency, they don't get counted as against this on average. So for example, if we look at Vic Beasley Jr., he's obviously an A+ for physique. Obviously this is a scouting certainty of 1. So that means it's the lowest certainty. 100 is obviously the highest. So this could all change once you scout someone. Obviously, we're just on the dashboard. We haven't gone into any teams. So we're looking at a very wide range of options here. But in terms of the media grades, obviously it's an A+ for physique at the moment. That means that he's probably in the top end of his current position of all the active players. So if you want to get a view in terms of how his rating might come out, it's useful to go into the search option, have a little look at active players first of all, and physique is generally strength, that type of thing, and have a little flick through and have a little look at how they compare. So obviously we've got a lot of active players that are highly ranked in sort of the top 90 or so. But it's really important, because if there's players who are in free agency who are top players who haven't signed, they are not going to be counted in that average. So it's an important thing to remember when thinking about these physical sort of media grades that appear. So obviously this is all A+ at the moment, because the certainty is 1. So it probably will change. So that would be my first tip, is think about it in perspective of active players. And obviously you can go into the search, as I did, look at active players, and you can export this. So you can export this and you can look at the ratings of individuals and look at it by position, and you can get a rough idea of maybe what scores will correspond to what type of rating range. So that's something I would suggest, as even if you scout players who have already been picked, make sure you have the file from when you just scouted available, so you can and export your current active players, and you can have a little look and see. So for example, if we go back to Vic Beasley and we know the physique is, say for example, it's 100% accurate and it's an A+, you can go in once he's been drafted and we see his ratings as the pick is made, and you can sort of get a feel for how that rating corresponds to the active players and get a feel for that range. There's a little bit of logic involved in that, and it takes a little bit of thinking through. But there's plenty of GMs on the forum and on the server who are happy to sort of give you a bit more explanation as to how maybe they might think about it, because everyone sort of applies that type of logic, but maybe in different types of fashion, different types of accuracy, depending on how much they've looked into this. So obviously the media grades are sort of your A's and A, B, C, etc. Your attributes are rated on, I think it's 13 scale description. In the help section, there is this all listed. Have a look, because that obviously gives you an indication of where the ranges sit, and it's not quite as obvious as it seems, is what I would say. So make sure you have a look at that. Obviously, someone like Vic Beasley Jr., we haven't scouted him on this one, but we can obviously, once we've done an interview, we can see his player personality ratings and see if that helps. People tend to maybe look at high work ethic, because that might help them develop. I'm a bit suspect as to whether that all sort of plays out like that, or whether it's a little bit more basic than it appears, but some people use that. And obviously the coach grades will be dependent. The higher the number means the higher the coach thinks of that player. You typically see that the offensive coach obviously scores higher on offensive players, defensive higher on defensive players, and the head coach tends to be a bit of a mix from what I've seen. But it's interesting, if you've scouted, you can get a view as to maybe how that corresponds. But I would say, for me personally, coach grades I take a little bit with a pinch of salt. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour of how to think about the draft and how to think about the scouting. Obviously, feel free to reach out to guys on the server. They're more than happy to sort of help take you through sort of things they look at and how they sort of consider the ratings against the grades and descriptions, etc. But hopefully it gives you a bit of a tip on that. And that kind of comes to the end of the show today. But we have a little special part of the show today, which is a fantastic idea that was shared by some of the GMs, which was to basically have a bit of fun towards the end and just give you guys a audio recording of one of the GMs talking about a couple of lines, and for you guys to try and figure out who it is. Sound bites of the GMs is what this little segment has been called. And what I'm planning to do with it is will release it in a second, and you'll hear it after this. And feel free to guess on the server, have a bit of fun with it, think out who it could be. And when we come back onto the next show, I will of course announce who that GM is and share it with you all. So here is the recording of the first GM to take part in Bites of the GMs. Who do you think it is?
The CSFL Kickoff show.
And there it is, our Bites of the GMs. First one up. Let us know who it is. But we will be back next time, I'm sure, to talk about draftees, ratings, off-season, more free agency, and I am absolutely certain there will be more blockbuster trades in the CSFL. But until next time, have a great off-season, and we'll catch up soon.